Before Islam, the Kaaba was already sacred. People were already traveling to Mecca. They were already circling the house. They were already treating this small stone building as a place where ordinary violence had to stop. But if you ask a simple question, who built it first? History suddenly gets very quiet. The Kaaba is one of the most recognized buildings on earth. A small cube in Mecca, black cloth, white marble, pilgrims moving around it in a human current so large that from above it almost looks like the world has a center. But the thing people forget is this. The Kaaba did not begin as an Islamic building in the simple modern sense. Islam made it the holiest site in the Muslim world, but the place itself was already sacred before Muhammad's mission. That is not a fringe claim. It is the normal historical starting point. Before Islam, the Kaaba was a sanctuary. It was connected to pilgrimage. It stood inside a protected sacred zone. And when Islam rose in the 7th century, it did not invent the idea that this place mattered. It redefined what the place meant. So this episode is not trying to do a cheap reveal. The title is not saying everything you know is false. The better question is more interesting. How does one sacred building carry more than one layer of memory? There is the layer Muslims know through scripture and tradition, Abraham and Ishmael raising the foundations of the house. There is the layer historians can talk about more cautiously, a pre-Islamic shrine in Mecca, used by tribes, rituals, pilgrimage, and sacred protection. And then there is the oldest layer, the one everyone wants, where the first builder would stand. That oldest layer is where the evidence thins out. The Kaaba is ancient in memory, but its first physical beginning is not sitting in a museum case with a label. One reason the Kaaba is powerful on screen is that it does not look like most famous monuments. It is not a pyramid. It is not a cathedral. It is not a ziggurat climbing toward the sky. It is a simple cube-like structure, and the movement happens around it. The building stays still while the people move. That movement matters. The Kaaba is the Qibla, the direction Muslims face in prayer. It is also the focus of Hajj and Umrah, where pilgrims perform tawaf, circling the house 7 times for Muslims. This is not just architecture. It is orientation. The body turns toward it. The community moves around it. The map of worship bends toward one point. But even before Islam, sanctuary mattered in Arabia. Sacred places were not just pretty religious landmarks. They were zones where rules changed. Weapons, bloodshed, trade, poetry, tribal rivalry, ritual purity, sacrifice, and pilgrimage could all be pulled into one protected space. That is the first big idea for the viewer. Sacred space is social technology. It tells people where they can gather when fighting must pause, which rituals count, who has status, and what story a tribe tells about itself. In the Islamic world, the Kaaba becomes the house of God, purified from idols and tied to Abrahamic monotheism. In the pre-Islamic world, the same location was already charged with sanctuary and ritual. That continuity is what makes the topic strong. The Kaaba was not important because it was large. It was important because people had learned to treat it as a center. The Quran gives the Kaaba its deepest sacred memory. In Surah Al-Baqarah, Abraham and Ishmael are described as raising the foundations of the house and praying for God to accept it from them. In Surah Al-Imran, the house at Baca is described as the first house established for humanity, blessed and a guidance for all people. That language is important. The Quran does not present the Kaaba as a random local shrine that Islam happened to adopt. It places the house inside the story of Abraham. It connects Mecca to the older drama of monotheism, covenant, worship, and submission to God. For believers, that is not just symbolism, it is sacred history. Abraham and Ishmael are not decorative names added to a building. They are part of why the building matters. But a documentary has to be careful with categories. The Quran is a scriptural source. It tells us how Islam understands the house. It is not the same kind of evidence as an inscription dug out of a dated archaeological layer from Abraham's lifetime. That distinction is not disrespect. It is clarity. We can say Islamic scripture and tradition connect the Kaaba to Abraham and Ishmael. We can also say historians do not have independent archaeological proof that identifies the first construction event with Abraham. The tension between those two sentences is the episode, not because one sentence destroys the other, but because they answer different kinds of questions. Faith asks what the house means. Historical method asks what can be independently verified. Around the Kaaba, those two conversations meet, but they do not become the same conversation. Now comes the honest part. The early history of the Kaaba is not well known. That sentence is easy to skip, but it is the most important guardrail in the whole video. We do not have a clean chain of dated stones taking us from the present structure back to Abraham. We do not have a surviving pre-Islamic building inscription that says, "This is when the Kaaba was first built." We do not have an excavation report from under the shrine that solves the whole thing. Part of the reason is obvious. This is not an abandoned ruin in the desert. It is a living sacred site, used by millions, rebuilt and repaired across centuries, surrounded by one of the most sensitive religious spaces in the world. You cannot treat it like an empty mound. So historians work with a mixed archive: the Quran, early Islamic tradition, later historical writing, comparative evidence from Arabian religion, ritual patterns, the known role of sanctuaries and pilgrimage in Arabia. But when we push too far back, the picture becomes less like a photograph and more like a silhouette. And that is not a failure. Ancient history often works this way. The closer a place is to living worship, the less it behaves like a frozen ruin. So the script should never say, "We now know exactly how the Kaaba began." We do not. The stronger claim is this: by the time Islam emerges, the Kaaba is already understood as an ancient and sacred house. What Islam does is not make it important from nothing. It gives that importance a new monotheistic meaning and places it inside the story of Abraham. Pre-Islamic Arabia was not one single religious system. It was a landscape of tribes, shrines, stones, gods, sacred months, pilgrimage routes, local traditions, Jewish communities, Christian communities, and older Arabian practices. Inside that world, a sanctuary was not just a place where people prayed, it was a place where normal life was suspended. A haram was protected. Bloodshed could be forbidden there. People could gather under special rules. Trade and ritual could happen in the shadow of the sacred. This is how the Kaaba becomes historically interesting, even before Islam. It was a shrine, yes, but also a social center, a place of memory, a place of tribal negotiation, a place where people came from outside the immediate city. The tradition says idols were housed there before Muhammad's conquest of Mecca. Other summaries of Arabian religion describe the Kaaba as a closed cella in a walled enclosure with a black stone set into the wall and Zamzam nearby. That combination, house, stone, well enclosure, pilgrimage, makes it part of a wider Arabian sacred landscape, even though the Kaaba itself becomes unique in Islamic history. The viewer should feel the difference between modern assumptions and ancient reality. A sanctuary was not simply a religious building. It was one of the few places where scattered groups could meet under rules bigger than one tribe. That is why the Kaaba being sacred before Islam matters. It means Islam inherited a place already thick with human attention, then transformed the meaning of that attention. If the Kaaba is the building everyone recognizes, the black stone is the object everyone asks about. It sits in the eastern corner of the Kaaba, now held in a silver frame. Pilgrims may try to touch or kiss it during tawaf, though doing so is not required. In Islamic tradition, it carries a story that reaches back to paradise, Adam, Abraham, and the sacred memory of the house. Historically, the stone also matters because sacred stones were not unusual in ancient Arabian religion. Britannica's discussion of Arabian sanctuaries uses the word baitil for a raised or sacred stone connected to divine presence. In that wider world, stones could act as focal points of worship, oath, offering, and identity. That does not mean the black stone is just one more pagan object. That word "just" is lazy. Objects change, meaning when traditions change. The same stone can sit inside one ritual world and then be reinterpreted inside another. The careful line is this: the black stone belongs to the Kaaba's deep sacred vocabulary. It is revered in Islamic practice, and it also makes sense against a broader Arabian background where stones, enclosures, wells, and pilgrimage were part of sacred life. For the visuals, this should be treated with restraint. No spooky glowing meteor, no fake close-up pretending to be archaeological proof. The image should make the viewer feel the object's gravity without turning it into fantasy. A hand near stone, silver, shadow, cloth, distance, reverence. The most dramatic pre-Islamic layer is the one Islam rejected: idols. Early Muslim tradition remembers the Kaaba before the conquest of Mecca as a place where idols were kept. When Muhammad entered Mecca in 630, the shrine was cleansed of polytheistic images and restored to the worship of one God. For a modern viewer, this can sound like a simple before and after: pagan shrine, then Islamic shrine. But the historical reality is more layered. Late antique Arabia was religiously mixed. Polytheistic practices existed, but so did Jewish and Christian communities, and many Arabs used the language of one high God even before Islam. So the story should not flatten everyone into cartoon idol worshippers. It should say what we can say: Islamic memory presents the pre-Islamic Kaaba as containing idols and being purified by Muhammad. That purification becomes one of the central turning points in the sacred biography of the site. And it changes the meaning of the house. The building is not discarded. It is not replaced. It is claimed as older than the idols inside it. That is the key narrative move. Islam does not say this shrine was false, so abandon it. It says, in effect, this house was true before it was polluted. The Kaaba becomes a restoration story, not a demolition story. That is much stronger than cheap controversy. The old sacred center remains. The meaning is stripped down, purified, and tied back to Abraham. There is one pre-Islamic moment from Muhammad's lifetime that tradition remembers vividly: the rebuilding of the Kaaba by Quraysh. The story is usually placed before his first revelation. The building had been damaged, and the clans of Quraysh took part in rebuilding it. Then a dispute broke out over who would have the honor of placing the black stone. Muhammad, not yet publicly known as the Prophet of Islam, is remembered as settling the dispute by placing the stone on a cloth so leaders from different clans could lift it together. For storytelling, this scene is gold. It has a damaged sacred building, rival clans, a dangerous honor dispute, and a solution that lets everyone participate. But its deeper value is not just drama. It shows the Kaaba as already central to Meccan prestige before Islam. The question of who placed the stone mattered because the house mattered. Ritual authority, tribal honor, and sacred architecture were tied together. This also helps the video avoid a vague origin fog. Even if the first beginning is hidden, the early 7th century memory is concrete. Mecca had a sacred house, Quraysh cared about it, and the black stone carried enough honor to create conflict. The reconstruction scene should be visualized respectfully. No prophet depiction. No identifiable face for Muhammad. Use hands, cloth, stone, clan elders, dust, and construction light. Let the scene tell the story without crossing into portrayal. A shrine does not survive on stone alone. It survives because people keep returning. Mecca's importance before Islam is often discussed through trade, pilgrimage, and tribal power. Scholars debate the scale of its trade networks, and we should not overstate what is uncertain. But we do not need to turn Mecca into a giant empire to understand the Kaaba's pull. A sanctuary can make a hard landscape usable. It gives travelers a protected destination. It gives tribes a shared ritual calendar. It lets commerce and worship overlap. It lets a ruling group gain status by caring for the house, controlling access, and hosting visitors. In that sense, the Kaaba was not only a sacred object, it was part of how Mecca organized itself. This is where the video can become very human. Imagine arriving in a valley after days of heat. You are not entering a museum. You are entering a protected zone full of noise. Animals, water, arguments, poetry, offerings, families, clan leaders, and strangers who normally might be enemies. At the center is the house. That is the image we want viewers to keep. Not an empty cube floating outside history, but a living sanctuary in a tribal world. Islam will later transform it into the center of a global religious community. But before that, it was already the center of something. This topic can go wrong fast. Some people hear the Kaaba was sacred before Islam and think it must be an attack. Others use the phrase like a weapon, as if pre-Islamic history automatically disproves Islamic meaning. That is not how history works. Sacred places often have layers. Jerusalem has layers. The Temple Mount has layers. Churches are built over older holy places. Mosques can stand inside older sacred geographies. A site can be reinterpreted without becoming fake. For Islam, the pre-Islamic layer is not an embarrassment. The traditional story already knows there was a before. It says the house was linked to Abraham, later surrounded by polytheism, and then restored to monotheistic worship. So the video should not behave like it has discovered a secret no Muslim ever heard. The smarter angle is that the Kaaba is powerful precisely because it is layered. It has scripture, memory, ritual, politics, architecture, and historical uncertainty, all compressed into one building. The phrase before Islam is the hook, but the real payoff is this. Before Islam, the Kaaba was sacred. After Islam, its sacredness was re-anchored in a new and total way. That is why the building survives as more than a relic. It is not simply old, it is continuously meaningful. Now we come back to the question everyone wants answered. Who built the Kaaba first? A believer can answer from Islamic tradition. Abraham and Ishmael raised the foundations of the house, connected to an even older sacred beginning in some traditions. A historian has to answer differently. The first physical origin of the Kaaba cannot be proven from independent archaeological evidence currently available to the public. That answer may feel unsatisfying, but it is honest, and honest uncertainty is better than fake certainty. We can trace how the Kaaba functions in Islamic scripture. We can talk about pre-Islamic sanctuary and pilgrimage. We can discuss the black stone, the well of Zamzam, the sacred precinct, idols, Quraysh, and Muhammad's purification of the shrine. We can show how the house becomes the direction of prayer and the center of pilgrimage. But the very first construction event sits behind the curtain. That missing evidence should not make the episode weaker. It gives the ending weight. The Kaaba is one of the most visible buildings on earth, but its beginning is partly invisible. Millions face it. Millions circle it. Yet the first hands that shaped the earliest house are beyond the reach of normal historical proof. That is the mystery, not a conspiracy, not a gotcha, a real ancient gap. The Kaaba feels ancient because it is more than stone. Stone can be rebuilt. Cloth can be replaced. Walls can be repaired. The black stone itself was broken and framed. The building has suffered damage and reconstruction across history. If sacredness depended only on uninterrupted original material, the story would be fragile. But sacred places do not survive only through original material. They survive through direction, repetition, memory, and return. People face the Kaaba. People circle it. People tell the story of Abraham and Ishmael. People remember the cleansing of the house. People repeat the journey. The center stays the center because each generation moves as if it is the center. That is the final point of the episode. The Kaaba was sacred before Islam, but Islam made it the axis of a civilization. The older sanctuary did not disappear, it was reinterpreted. The tribal shrine became the house of God for a global community, and the origin remained just out of reach. Maybe that is why the story holds. The Kaaba is not a solved object, it is a living center with an ancient shadow. Scripture tells one kind of truth about it, history can tell another, and between them stands the house itself, small, black, silent, and still pulling the world around it.